here, so I'm happy to stick around afterwards if you'll have me. Today we're going to be talking about a report that came out by the World Health Organization, which looks into gaming and the possibility of categorizing a specific type of gaming as a potential disorder. And we want to talk about it in depth because we think it's an important point to address and to kind of give some balance to the report and how it's been put out. We have four amazing people on the panel with us today. What I propose to do is give you a quick introduction to them, and then afterwards let them talk a little bit more about themselves and kind of how they got into this business, and then we'll jump into the specific topic, which is this World Health Organization report. So, Kelly, what's your last name? Dunlap. I just met her. Is a, where are you on my thing here? Oh, here they are. She's a mental health research and design manager at iThrive Games, and she also has a PhD in clinical psychology. So, welcome to Kelly. Francois Boucher-Jeunesse is a game designer from Yulu Lab. They make math games, which are really, really amazing, and he's also from Quebec. Santeri Koivisto, who is the CEO and co-founder of Teacher Gaming, and he also brought us the educational version of Minecraft. And Sean Young, who is the CEO of Classcraft, which is a way to gamify your classroom and the experience of learning. And he's also from Quebec, so we have three Quebecers. So what I wanted to do first is I wanted to send it out to you guys to talk a little bit about, the panel discussion today is about the negative sides of gaming and the potential negative sides of gaming, but I wanted to start off on a more positive note because we have a bunch of kids here today who probably love gaming and we want to talk about the benefits of gaming. So I wanted to give everyone a quick chance to talk about themselves and maybe a game that they really love and why they love it. So Kelly, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start. I am a huge gamer. I've been playing pretty much all my life. My favorite game for campaign is Halo 2. My favorite multiplayer is Halo 3. What else did you want us to say?
Well, a little bit. Why you got into the business and how maybe playing games brought you into this industry.
So I started out my undergrad as a Russian language and studies major, and then I switched to psychology, as one does. And I did my undergrad research on aggression in video games, mostly because at the time all the research that was coming out by Anderson and Bushman and Gentile was focused on how violent video games made players more violent. And that was so antithetical to my personal experiences because games like Halo, which is a shooter, it brought my entire dorm together. We would play LAN parties. We would play into the night. We would sometimes do all-nighters playing video games. But it was this really wonderful social bonding experience. And so when I did my research, I actually found that it wasn't the level of violence in a game that made people frustrated, but rather the frustration with learning a new control scheme. So if they hadn't played a game before, they had much higher levels of frustration and irritation and anger. And if they'd played a game, even if it was super violent, but they were familiar with it, you didn't see that spike. And so when I went to grad school and pursued my doctorate in clinical psychology, I continued that research. My dissertation was on mental health in games, specifically if there was an interaction. Surprise, no. So spoilers, if you ever want to read it. The only indicator of mental health outcomes in games was why you played. So if you, for example, if you were playing to relax and play with your friends, there was no mental health issues. If you were using games to escape your problems and like ignore the rest of the world, then you might see a little bit more depression, a little bit more anxiety. And then after that, I went and got my master's in game design because I truly believe if you want to study something, you have to really understand the medium that you're studying. And then since then, I've just continued to do research in this area, both the psychology in games and games in psychology.
Awesome. Francois, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your path to becoming a game designer, and maybe a game or some games that you really like playing?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm an engineer by, I guess I grew up as an engineer, but I at some point wanted to go in the game design side of things, and so I actually worked on Halo, so I probably should tell you about that after. So I worked for big companies and shooters, and I had a change of heart at some point because it was, while I thought the impact of these types of games were great in terms of reaching a lot of people, I wanted to work on video games that I could actually measure the impact on just how it makes people evolve and grow, right? And a good way to measure things, or a good area in which you can measure progress, is education. And so I went back to do a master in education, work on basically studying both how to create these games, but also the efficacy and the impact of these games. And the results were quite amazing from that master and from the game that I worked on. So much so that I decided to keep going and actually create UDLab to keep creating these educational video game experiences. And it turns out that the research that was done by other professors on the impact of the games that we worked on is also great. And so I'm happy to go about that in details later. The games that I like myself are games that actually reflect what I like about my job sometimes. So when I create video games, it's very much an engineering process of trying different things out, and then most of the time it doesn't work, and so you iterate, right? And it's kind of this loop of finding new ways to build stuff. And there's a lot of games that actually do this, right? Kerbal Space Program is a great example of this. I'm playing right now Oxygen Not Included. It's awesome. I'm trying to figure out why gases don't mix and whatnot. So there's Minecraft is a good example of that too. So there's a great potential for learning how to actually work through engineering problems that just gets me really excited about games. So that's my own positive experience about it.
Santeri?
Yeah, hey. Well, I've been a gamer since I was 6, so that makes, 26 years? But I've been also playing the piano about the same time, and I'm definitely much better at playing piano than I'm playing games, although I really try. So favorite games, definitely RPGs. And there was this one weekend a few years back. I've been since very happily in a relationship, but I was a single man. And I don't want to brag, but there was one weekend that I actually had 2 dates, one on Friday, one on Saturday. And but on the same weekend, Fallout 4 came out. And I decided to cancel those dates and play Fallout 4 for the whole weekend. So if my mother would know, she would probably diagnose me with gaming disorder. But my transformative moment with games, and that, my background is in education, I'm a teacher. So I was doing my master's and I was substitute teacher for a class in northern or maybe more like eastern Finland. And I tried Minecraft with my class. It was 2010. And they were so excited, so goal-oriented. My relationship with my class changed tremendously and in a positive direction. That was sort of the moment for me that I saw that not only, there is a big potential, from an entertainment point of view, but, all the energy that kids are spending with video games, I could now leverage also in my classroom. So that got me excited and, led me to Isaac eventually.
Sean?
My name is Sean. My story is I've been a gamer all my life. We bought an NES when I was 4, and started training up on playing Mario Brothers at the tender age of 4. And games have really been an ongoing narrative within my own personal life, and a medium through which when you get good at gaming, it becomes very meditative. So some people do yoga, I do video game. And the game that had a really big impact on my life was really World of Warcraft. And much like Centauri, I came to a place in my life where I was playing, I just started teaching. I was a teacher for 10 years. And the first year that I was teaching, I was also playing 30 hours a week of World of Warcraft. And realized that it was really taking over my life in a way that, people would hey, what are you doing Wednesday night? Let's go out for a drink. I'm like, I can't. I have to go raid. And what's interesting with MMORPGs is that because of the collaborative structure, you really need to be playing with other people. So it really becomes this activity that bleeds over into demanding specific time slots in your real life. So once I realized that was happening, I just quit. I've never played another MMORPG again, just because I know that I could just sink 1 million hours into that. So I'm playing a lot of open world games now. Playing Red Dead Redemption right now, for example. So games that are massive like MMORPGs, but that don't have an online component, so you can actually put them on pause. And so that gaming experience and the what I had seen for me, the benefits, I really wanted to bring that to my classroom. So much like Centauri, who did that around a commercial video game in Minecraft, I built my own gaming system, which was really this mix of like digital and real life interactions. And so bringing the gaming mechanics and the gaming potential and what's so motivating about that experience into real world experiences and exchanges within the classroom. And that's how I started Classcraft, which is a platform to do that work. And so I've had a lot of experience now in the ed space for the past 5 years working with schools all over the world in terms of implementing that type of gaming approach to real life instruction.
All right, thank you, everyone. What I'd like to propose right now is that we delve a little bit into the World Health Organization report or draft of a report which addresses this concern of a potential video game disorder and playing too many games or too often. The way that I would like to break it down is I'd like to talk with the panel members first, and then after that I'd like to open it up to questions. Any people have questions or any people have concerns about video games, any parents that are out there that have kids that they think are playing too many games, maybe you could present your concerns, and then we could address that not only from a gamer perspective, but also from a game design perspective and also from a clinical perspective. So what I propose is right now is I'll read a summary of the report and some of the diagnosis criteria for this gaming disorder, and then afterwards I'm going to ask everyone a little bit about what they believe are healthy gaming habits and maybe unhealthy gaming habits with respect to this breakdown. Yeah. So we'll put it up there so you're not, I'm just not just reading from a piece of paper.
Is that working? Yeah? All right.
We won't read the whole thing, we'll just read the first two paragraphs. So gaming disorder is defined in the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11, as a pattern of gaming behavior, digital gaming or video gaming, characterized by impaired control over gaming, increasing priority given to gaming over other activities, to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other interests and daily activities, and continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. For gaming disorder to be diagnosed, the behavior pattern must be of sufficient severity to result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and would normally have been evident for at least 12 months. So I'm going to open it up to the panel. Based on this potential breakdown of the video game disorder, how would you define healthy versus unhealthy gaming behavior? Anyone can start.
I feel like Kelly should go.
So, I don't think video games and unhealthy video game habits would be anything different than anything else we enjoy. There's the idea that anything done to excess is too much. Like, that's inherent in the term too much. You know, too much water and we drown, too much oxygen and we actually suffocate. And so I think if you are playing games to the exclusion of everything else, you know, your grades are dropping, you're not going to work, you aren't eating properly, you're not maintaining hygiene. Like, these are all indicators that we would see across any kind of mental health issue. You know, for example, depression, you tend to lose some of your hygiene, you don't go to work. And so this idea that the activity you're engaging in is having a significant negative impact on your life is how I would frame problematic gaming. But again, just emphasizing that that can be applied to anything. If you were to read a book to the extent that you no longer went to school or went to work or took a shower. So yeah, that's kind of how I conceptualize problematic gaming.
Anyone else feel like, Sean, you touched on it, or Centauri, times in your life or other people that you've seen you felt were gaming in a healthy way or an unhealthy way?
Well, just like one point that I want to make from more of a teacher point of view is that something that we say in Finland is that limits are love, and this goes to parenting. Meaning that, I understand that games are probably the biggest parenting challenge of today, because kids are really drawn into video games. And of course, as parents, our sort of role there and our responsibility is to also, provide different opportunities for our kids to also do other things than only stare at screen. And at the same time, if you as a parent are scrolling through Facebook for 12 hours a day, don't be very surprised if your child wants to do the same thing.
I would also add to that what we're talking about here is extreme behavior. It's really like I know a lot of gamers, obviously, and a lot of them have a very healthy relationship to gaming. They probably play more video games than a lot of people would consider to be, normal for them. But, those people are watching Netflix for 3 hours a day. So what's the big difference? I do believe that, to me, there's a danger in this report about people demonizing games and ostracizing this medium. I think that it's really just another form of, and I wouldn't even call it entertainment anymore. It's just a form of culture. It's a way that we, escape in the same way we watch movies, in the same way we read books. I mean, if kids were spending 12 hours a day, reading books, would we consider that to be detrimental? I know for a fact myself in high school I was reading, a novel a day. I was going to bed at 4 a.m. every day reading, fantasy books. That was detrimental to my health, and yet nobody was concerned with that because reading is such a noble activity. And so I think that there's a cultural context to this report around the fact that games are, in the span of human existence, games are a very new medium. Digital games are, less than 30 years old in a proper mainstream sense. We can argue about when they actually started, but in a way that anybody could play a game is it's not that old. And so I think that as we're looking at that, and the people who are analyzing these behaviors aren't necessarily gamers themselves. It's not necessarily a medium that they understand, and so it's very easy to say, well, oh look, the WHO said that there's gaming disorder, therefore video games are bad, therefore we should control it and ostracize it. And so I really believe that we should have an educational approach in helping kids. Kids develop well if they have diversity in activities. That's just a normal, as Kelly was saying, just a normal way to look at student growth. And so, any student that's doing anything more than 5 hours a day, I'd be concerned. And maybe they're at school too much as well, because they're doing that a lot of hours a day. But I without being facetious, I would say that we have to acknowledge that there are negative behaviors associated to people who go very far down the spectrum of gaming, but it's really not a mainstream reality.
So I would agree with that nuance, and maybe another nuance I would like to add, which is a side effect of the fact it's been only 30 years that games exist, right, is we really don't have a vocabulary and a good literacy of gaming in general as a culture, right? So for example, movies have been around for a long while, and so, people know what I mean when I say a Hollywood action movie versus a documentary, and these could all be considered to be films, right? But I doubt that documentaries would get as much of a judgment as Hollywood movies, right? We understand the nuances between these things. We really don't have that for gaming. And there are games that lend themselves more to addictive behaviors, such as, World of Warcraft, MMOs would probably fall in that category. Mobile games that, Candy Crush or something that I would probably fall in that category as well. But I wouldn't say that, the games we're making, for example, you can only play 3 hours, right? And you're done with the game and that's it, right? So it doesn't really lend it to an addiction, for kids, right? And so it's really important, I think, to distinguish between that as well, to not just basically say all of gaming is bad, right? If your kid has a problem with addiction, for example, there might be some games that would be good for him that he might like as well, right? And maybe you don't want him to play MMOs for a little bit, at least until he gets his own things figured out, right? So.
And I just want to add real quick in terms of what healthy gaming looks like, because I know we don't always want to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
For players, are you enjoying yourself? Are you having a good time? Are you engaging with the content of the game? Are you engaging with your friends? Is it generally a positive experience? Because we all know rage quits happen, like it's part of gaming. But if that's continually happening, then maybe you do need to step back and take a break. But if you're engaging in the game and you're having a good time and it's a positive experience, then that's completely healthy, pretty much. And as long as you're still doing all the other things that you need to do in life, like go to school and keep your grades up, there's nothing wrong with it. And there's no time limit you can put on that. If you look at students who are doing esports scholarships and they're literally going to college because of how well they play games, or people who do esports commentating or sportscasting, like these people are sinking 20, 30, 40-hour weeks into games, but for them, that's part of their life, and that's how they're making their world work. So I just wanted to shout out to players. As long as it's still something you enjoy, you're probably fine. For parents, the big thing, and for parents, are your kids doing their chores? Are they still keeping their grades up? Are they still socializing with their friends? Like if they're doing all the normal things a kid would do, then you really don't have too much to worry about.
Normal kids don't do chores, though.
So there's no worries that they're ditching the dishes to play video games. I know I do that all the time. Like the dishes will do themselves. And then the last thing I do want to point out is we seem to be contextualizing kids as being the ones who are most vulnerable to excessive gaming. But in my experience, it's not kids who are the ones who are logging that many hours and engaging in problematic behaviors. It tends to be adults, grown-ups who are doing it because there's no one there to check them. And they were like, well, I'm grown up, I can do whatever I want. So just throwing it out there that the idea of problematic gaming is not limited to children or adolescents. It is actually much more common in older, by older I mean like 25 and up.
Something I want to point out, this is slightly outside of our scope, but the sort of the economical effect, sort of the macro effect of games nowadays, like how big of a business it is, and what the impact for our sort of society is. Now, the top 10 biggest earners in Finland last year were game developers, like the top 10 people. There were game developers and game company founders, cryptocurrency guys, and esports players.
All right. All of us up here on the panel make educational games, and I wanted to ask a little bit about how the perception of gaming as a potentially negative behavior with its different kind of elements, has that affected the way that you either design games or that you try to promote games in the classroom? Has that slowed the process down, or has it made it difficult, or has it created any obstacles that have prevented you from getting games into the classroom, positive games in the classroom?
I'm going to give that to the teachers.
Well, I think that there's since we started Classcraft, 5 years ago I had to convince people that using games in education was a good idea. Now all I need to do is convince them that Classcraft is the best way to do it. So I think that there, even in the last 5 years, has been a real shift around the decision makers in education opening themselves up to the idea that we can use video games in a way that is helpful and that can have a real impact around educational outcomes. So I think that there's a real shift happening as games become more and more mainstream. I do believe, though, that there's a concern around screen time in education that is legitimate. I share that concern. I think that, but that's not a problem with gaming. That's a problem with all the other digital tools as well that kids are like. We could imagine the day in the life of a child at school to be in front of a computer screen all day and not doing any gaming. And to me, that would be really problematic as well. And so, and I think there's a bit of a tendency to go towards that, especially in the U.S. as we're highly digitizing, the education systems right now. So there's a bit of an effect there around that has a halo effect on the perception of games as like another way to generate screen time. That said, I've seen a ton of positive response from parents around our approach. Some people are like, oh, parents must be, not interested in Classcraft because they're worried about their kids playing video games. These parents are all gamers. Like 60% of North Americans play video games multiple times a week. So the parents are playing games as well, and they understand the medium and they embrace the approach. Like that's been my general observation. I do think that the resistance comes from folks who see games as a waste of time. There's this like, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about reading. Like, oh, like spending a whole bunch of time reading novels is good, and spending a whole bunch of time on a game is bad. And that's really just a cultural set of values, and it's really, in my mind, related to the fact that we don't understand the medium yet. It's not old enough for, as a society, to, like, and worldwide as a society, to really understand and embrace it. I think that as, like, we become more used to it, and we become an older society with gaming, like, imbricked in our lives in such a mainstream way as it is now, we're going to understand the nuances of gaming. Like, there's different types of games, and there's different types of experiences, and appreciate the potential for social change that is positive coming from games.
I've been going around mostly United States, Finland, and now last year in India. And I've met a few hundred school leaders, school owners, also in India. And I would say 95% of these people who run schools, also including teachers, understand that games are here to stay. We are not going to get rid of them anytime soon, maybe never. And so only way is to really see how can we leverage game, because kids are spending so much energy already into games. So my personal interest has always been that, okay, what games students already play, can we use those games in our advantage in the class? Some feedback that what Sean mentioned, that parents are very, very supportive. Actually, a few times in India, in a meeting with school, there has been a parent involved also in the meeting. And they have, after 5 minutes of listening to me, started pitching the idea to the school leader. But one just actual comment from United States, actually, very early days, like 6 years ago, when we started working on Minecraft, was that he said to the teacher at school that I've been completely lost with my child only wanting to play video games. Thank God the school is doing something.
Sure. I guess I have a little bit of a different angle, and it's mostly about the research. And so one of the things that's very concerning about the WHO putting out this report is, and pushing the idea that gaming disorder is a thing, is that it will encourage research that will be confirmatory rather than exploratory. So the research around, games in schools and games in mental health will likely shift towards confirming those diagnostic criteria as either true or false, as opposed to exploring, is this even its own concept? Does it deserve to be its own disorder? What if it's something else? And so I think that is going to has the potential to have a significant negative impact across all the fields, because if the research is being steered in one direction as opposed to exploring all possibilities, then you're really going to limit what you can actually learn and really understand what is driving problematic behavior.
I mean, I can go really quickly on this one, but for us, what's been hurting us more as far as like the perception of games, right, is just, again, a lack of literacy. And so the challenge has been to differentiate our type of games versus other educational type of games, such as gamification, for example, right? Often educational video games just really mean glorified multiple answer questions with rewards to it, right? And so differentiating ourselves from that has been the challenge. But I don't think I perceive a wide kind of criticism of games as much. I think similar to Sean on my end.
Okay. I'd like to give Kelly a quick chance to go through the diagnosis or the draft proposal by the World Health Organization, because she wrote a really interesting article about it that she'll tell you more about. And I think that she has a really interesting perspective because she loves games, she makes games, and she's a clinical psychologist. So I think that if you have the inkling, the motivation to go into a little bit of the breakdown and how maybe the breakdown of the potential gaming disorder has some problems and some issues with it, and kind of just lay it out there for everyone to kind of understand it a little bit better from your perspective.
Oh boy. Okay. Can we actually get the criteria back up on the screen? Because that'll probably be helpful. So I think the first thing that's important to throw out there is that gaming disorder is not a thing, or not an official diagnosis yet. It is a proposed disorder. It first needs to be ratified by countries who support the ICD-11. So that's going to happen if it happens, it'll be sometimes in 2019. And if it does become ratified, then the actual disorder itself would not be something that you could apply until 2022. So if someone is telling you, oh, I can diagnose you with gaming disorder, they are either wrong or they're lying. So they're either misinformed or they're not telling the truth. So that's something really important to keep in mind, is that even though it's proposed, it does not mean it's a thing. It doesn't exist yet, technically. As a clinician, I have done my fair share of diagnosing. And one thing that really bothers me about this particular set of criteria is just how incredibly vague it is. So, thank you. Oh. So there's really only 3 main criteria for diagnosing somebody with gaming disorder as it currently is proposed. And it's impaired control over gaming, meaning do you have trouble regulating how much you play games? And that's really all the information that the WHO gives us. As clinicians, that can mean anything. I don't know what that means. What does that look like? There's no guidance or specificity about what is control over your impulse to play. Does that mean you're playing 20 hours a week? Does that mean you can't stop? It's completely vague and very confusing. The next one is increasing priority given to gaming and other activities to the extent that games take precedence over other interests and daily activities. So literally, if you choose to play video games instead of doing the dishes, that meets that criteria, which is absolutely absurd. And if you think about that in terms of any other game, like what if your kid was playing soccer or football, I guess, since we're in India? What if they were playing football and they were doing that instead of doing the dishes, and they kept getting good, and so now they're moving up to varsity or semi-pro. They're spending 60 hours a week doing practice. We don't see that as problematic, even though it's taking precedence over other life issues. And similarly, the last bit here is that the use continues or escalates despite the occurrence of negative consequences. And there's no definition of what a negative consequence is. So I have no way as a clinician to conceptualize what that means. And again, using the football reference, what if you tear your ACL? That's a serious negative consequence, but we don't see that as being something that we're not going to diagnose somebody with sports disorder.
Or when you look at football, the American football and concussions, there's a very large new way of thinking about the sport, which is incredibly popular in the United States, but for children and even for adults, but especially for children who are in early developmental stages with their brain, the act of putting your head and slamming it into something else has serious negative consequences, yet it is a sport that is often looked at in a very positive way because it brings about discipline and there's a lot of physical activity in it. So just from my perspective, I grew up playing a lot of sports, so I understand the sports world really well, and it's what I relate to. I'm not much of a gamer. I actually I played Candy Crush. You can all gasp right now if you want. So I understand it from that perspective. And when I read this, I played a lot of tennis as a child, and I didn't have any negative consequences for it. But if I would have just transferred that to football, there would be negative consequences. So we don't have a football disorder that's out there. And even for soccer, for that matter, heading to football.
And so not only is this incredibly vague, and as a clinician make me feel incredibly uncomfortable, but there's no definition here that shows that it's somehow unique from other things that we do to access. So the idea that gaming disorder itself is a unique thing that requires its own diagnosis is somewhat problematic. And then the last bit here is that these symptoms have to be prevalent for 12 months. However, there's actually a subsection in the definition saying that time limit can be ignored if the severity of the symptoms are severe enough. But of course, there's no definition about what severe is. So as a clinician, I have no idea. Based on this, I could diagnose myself with gaming disorder. I could probably diagnose everybody on this panel, except maybe you, with gaming disorder. And so it's that vagueness and that lack of specificity. And I'm somebody who knows games. I would know what, gaming too much might look like, more than anyone else, probably, maybe. And mental health clinicians who are less versed in games and what normal, quote unquote, looks like the potential to have false positives, to overdiagnose this it's really, really concerning.
I was going to exactly say that. I agree. I think that the way the definition is worded opens up for bias in a really concerning way. Because when you think of people who are in a position to diagnose this type of disorder, they're older people who haven't grown up with video games. They probably often, not all of them, well, are going to be people who, gaming isn't necessarily part of their, main activities. So of course they're going to have the potential to have a read on this that is negative.
And there's actually research that backs that up. There's a really fascinating study, I think it was done by Shavilsky, that looked at mental health providers and their perspectives on video games. And there's a very, very strong inverse correlation. The older you are, the less you think of video games. And the younger the clinician is, the fewer negative ideas they hold about video games. And so there actually is a very strong research-based bias based on age of who's making these diagnoses and how likely they are to see games as inherently bad before the person even walks in the door.
Nowadays, what often happens is that if you have, you hurt somewhere, then you go to Google, you type in your symptoms, and the first thing you get, you have cancer. So I'm sure that when this gets viral, every parent looks at their child and diagnoses gaming disorder.
Yeah, there's a big difference. Who was it said that what this is we're trying to medically identify things that parents don't like. And so if the parent doesn't like your child doing something, they try to find a way to rationalize it. And at least in the case of gaming disorder, if we call it an addiction, then it gives them the right to feel like, okay, I don't like this, I don't understand this, so it must be something wrong with my kid.
Kelly, would you agree that there's to me, I feel like there's also something even more vague in this around what is a video game? I think that we've been talking about this for the past 3 days together about what is a video game? How do you define that? What are different types of video games? Is a video game an interactive digital experience? Maybe, but that's so is a word processor. So how do we define the difference between using any piece of software versus using a digital game versus, and there's games that are not very interactive and they're almost movies. The what is a game is such a broad thing in my mind that to me that even is more concerning almost than this, because you could diagnose any digital activity that way, right?
I mean, in theory, because there's no specificity. And I think it's important to highlight that even the mental health professionals who think that there should be a diagnosis for gaming disorder, they universally, across the board, believe that the current criteria isn't good enough. So even people who think that this should be something you can diagnose think that this criteria is too vague and it is going to cause some kind of harm, whether it's overdiagnosing, false positives, things like that. So even when your fans are even against you, I think you really do need to check what you're doing and make some revisions. And so we'll see what happens.
What I'd like to do right now is tell you a quick story and then open it up to questions. Yesterday we were in a press conference with a lot of people from Quebec. We're about 6 or 7 people, and we were telling really, I think, great stories about how we were teachers and we loved games. We saw the power in games. We created studios and we built these studios up and we put products into the market. And the journalists listened and they took notes, and then we asked them if they had any questions. And the first question was, well, why do you work in this field when playing video games hurts people's eyes? And why do you work in this field when people are just playing too many video games? Literally, those were the only questions that we got, and it was really shocking to me. I thought we were going to talk about kind of our journeys, and we kind of went into that direction. So we answered those questions, and we're able to answer those questions. Are there any kids out there, or parents out there, or teachers out there that have either heard about these different types of concerns or have these concerns that would like to ask a question? Because you really have an amazing panel up here that can answer these questions and give you a very complete understanding of the whole culture.
Or even if we want to tackle the perceived badness of games in general, are there other concerns than addiction, for example, right? Violence in video games has been a concern in the States for a while before research kind of dismissed it, right? Finally, but yeah.
Obesity. Yeah. Video games make us fat.
Yeah. Anyone? Yeah.
So I think what's very clear amongst all the panelists is it is a battle of definitions. It is who gets to define because WHO is supposedly an authority from the health side of it. And it's WHO's report. All of you have your own experience and you're in your own way, authorities, on the educational gaming perspective out of it. Now, since it's a new phenomenon in which parents also, children also, medical community also, and gamers also, all of them are trying to define one common thing. How do we define and segregate? What, Francois, you referred to also. So my question is, again, it's the fear of unknown which is where these studies would get used or referenced. It's not, they're not going to be interventions or other actions which are going to come, because as Kelly mentioned, these are too vague right now to diagnose or to take action on. These are not actionable definitions. So this is the same problem which in artificial intelligence or any other thing which is relatively new or is still caught in the battle of definitions, is getting lost somewhere. How do you plan? Because I think this conference or some places like this where both sides get to talk to each other with community it starts with. But how do we do that at scale? Because right now also parents are already referring to this in their homes. So my question is, how do we do it? How do we fast forward this so that, because on one side we are really saying that it's life-changing, games can change lives, and in something like education, it can transform the minds. And on the other side, when the negative side of it comes in, we cannot just dismiss, we would have to take it responsibly and I think define things really fast so that people then can refer back and then be accurate in that. Your thoughts?
Am I summarizing the question well when I say that, like, how do we scale the education part of video games and basically scale the message that video games can be, these types of games can be good? Is that a summary? Yeah. I mean, my own personal approach is to try and make the best educational games that I can and not compromise on anything on that end of things, right? And then try to promote them and use them as examples, right? And usually, like I have not seen a case of a parent, a teacher, or just a random adult looking at the games, or kids looking at the games that we make, and then afterward having an opinion about the negative side of gaming, for example, right? Like once they played it, they understand, oh, it's just an interactive way to learn a really complex subject, right? And they all get it. But if they haven't played the game and I just come up and just tell them, then it doesn't work, right? So for me, the best way to do it is actually to promote, like create these games and promote them. And I think after most people will see them, right, then once we have, I guess Minecraft is maybe a good example of that, but once we have like big hits, I think the perception will change globally. So, yeah.
So on one hand, I'm yes, everything he said, yes, like push forward. I would push back against the idea of research being fast, because research being fast is bad, and usually bad things come of it. So if we want to really move the conversation from an empirical base, what we need is more research. The American Psychological Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual had internet gaming disorder as a proposed disorder for the last version, but they moved it to something for further study, because they realized that even though this is a concern, it's something that there's not enough information about to actually have concrete criteria that it is a specific thing unto itself. So I love that these guys are pushing ed games forward and putting really cool examples out there and like getting that kind of anecdotal evidence. Yes, that's what can move quickly. And then hopefully the research underneath is going to move more slowly, just so that we know that it's good and it's replicable and it's reputable. And I hope that this findings support what you guys are doing. Fingers crossed, but you never know with science.
I would say as well, like this report is about the need for cultural norms. Like the reason that it's getting fast-tracked, despite the lack of research around the topic and the lack of definition around what the actual disorder is and even around what video games are, is because it's changed so fast that parents, educators, adults, everybody's trying to understand what is a normal behavior in terms of interacting with digital games, and the need for that is really big because it's happened so fast, and we've gone from like games are this niche thing that geeks are playing in their basement to like everybody's doing it. And to me, like this is a symptom of this need to get social guidelines around what is normal behavior. We want, as a society, worldwide, we want somebody to tell us what's normal and then and reinforce that normality. And so I think we're in a state of transition right now around this medium because we don't know what's normal and we don't even know what the medium is. And so I think that there's also just a question of time as we get more used to the idea, as more kids go through the school system using games, as more parents become accustomed to, understanding that even though their kids spent, 10,000 hours playing video games growing up, they're still going to grow up into productive citizens. And as that becomes more normal, these norms are going to self-define themselves around what we consider, normal behavior. So I think that there's, we have our mission. Let's make great games and put that forward. Let's do the research. But I think also time is just going to solve the issue as well.
There was a question back there from this young man.
Hey, just one quick question. So you are promoting games to destroy people's eyes? No. This is more a question to Kelly, and everyone else can also take part. But I guess we're all ending at a place where the definition is too vague. You can basically diagnose anyone. But how would you go about? I mean, myself personally included, I don't think we need necessarily a diagnosis for gaming disorder specifically. But if we were to have one, how would you improve it? What would be the kind of definition? What would be the triggers of you as a psychologist to actually go about diagnosing one? So what kind of triggers would you think there would be? Thank you.
That's a great question. So there are people, at least in the U.S., who, if they're not getting treatment for quote-unquote gaming disorder, they're getting treatment for problematic gaming. And a few of my colleagues who work extensively with this population have found that the most effective interventions are the ones that resemble treatment for obsessive-compulsive disorder. So the idea that if you are having difficulty managing your gameplay is that it's more akin to an impulse control issue than it is to an addiction. So when we think addiction, we think of hard drugs, we think of alcohol, we think of substances that we put into our body that alters the neurochemicals in our brains. When we think about something like OCD or other impulse control disorders, it's more of ruminative and obsessive thought and this internal need to do this thing that isn't really core to our survival. So in order to treat that kind of thing, if it is an actual thing, that would be my predilection. I've also found that individuals who are in treatment for quote-unquote gaming addiction or gaming too much, the excessive gaming is actually 99.9% of the time the symptom of what is going on. That there is some other underlying mental health condition, and they're using games as a way to treat that. So if someone is depressed, they're using games to make themselves feel better. If someone's socially isolated because they have social anxiety, they're using games to connect socially with other people. And that's how they're getting those kinds of basic human needs met. So if you just take the game away, you're actually just ripping away the only coping mechanism they have that works. And so that can absolutely be detrimental. And that is more akin to the addiction model, where it's like abstinence. If you're an alcoholic, you can never have a drink. If you're a gaming addict, you can never play a game. And that's just counterintuitive to the way that we use games, to the way we understand games in a mental health perspective. So probably one of those two.
Hi, I have a question. Do you think that this misconception regarding digital games is mostly because there's very little research that's put out there about how good it is actually or the positive effects of gaming on children? And just taking from Sean's example of reading, there's a lot of research on, if you read for 10 hours, etc., however long it is, there's a lot of benefits on how good your analytical skills are, your language abilities, your understanding of, etc. So do you think that is something that maybe educators need to look into and work more actively towards? And also, since you are all gamers as well as educators, what is actually the biggest sort of positive outcome of gaming for young kids?
Now, all educators, from my opinion, at least based on the research that I've been reading, where you should be aiming at is to create sort of a flow state in your students, where they sort of lost the track of time and they are so engaged with the topic that I just want to learn everything about it. And game design is sort of art of keeping people in a flow state. So obviously, game then becomes this really beautiful sort of learning medium, of course, if the other targets are aligned, where all the small rewards, all the progress that you are seeing, all the other sort of features of the game, just keep you going towards your goal. So I think that the overall, the engagement and the flow state that the game can create is one of the biggest perks that games have.
I'm actually, as I told you earlier, I'm not a gamer. I love sports, which is also a game, but I don't play video games. But I understand their power, and I see how my students use them, and I understand their ability to put people in flow. And actually, I did a research study with a really great researcher, really creative. And what we did was we looked at second language learning activities. So when you're learning a second language, you do activities, and we looked at those, and what we did was we broke them down in their components, and we tried to figure out what components of second language activities brought students into flow. Flow is this idea of losing yourself in an activity, getting into the groove, like losing track of time. And we went through a bunch of different criteria, like was there planning or no planning? Was it reading? Was it writing? Was it listening? Was it talking? And the criteria that created the most flow was it a game or was it not a game? And when it was a game, it was the most flow-inducing activity in our entire study. We got funded for it, and we're doing a much bigger study now because we want to go a little bit further in this. But I was not doing this research study to really support games. I was really doing it because I'm a second language teacher, and I really wanted to know this, and I really thought that this would be a great set of best practices to put out there. How do we create flow in the classroom? And it really just turned out that games created the most flow. So it's scientific that games do this, and I believe that that's what we should be striving for in the classroom.
So in terms of your question about why there's so much research focusing on the negative, the very cynical side of me is because that's where the clicks are, that's where the dollar bills are. It's a lot easier to ask for a grant when your ask is, we need to save our children from this horrible thing that's happening to them, as opposed to getting grant money for, yeah, we think the kids are fine. And so that can be really challenging in terms of just funding the research. There's also a very strong predilection in human psychology to fear that which we don't understand. And so you see this throughout time. So right now it's video games. In the future it's going to be VR and mixed reality. Before video games, pinball was scandalous. It was actually banned in the U.S., specifically in New York, for like 40 years because of its moral corruption. And before pinball, there was concerns that the radio would take children away from their studies, and the phonograph, and the printing press, and the novel as being scandalous. And so every generation has its medium, usually tied to entertainment in some way. And we are very worried about what the kids are doing. And so I think it's just kind of the part of the grand tradition of being human, of worrying about, hey, get off my lawn, and, what you're doing is probably bad, because we don't understand it. In terms of what games can do in a positive way, my favorite thing to think about is that games help us become who we truly are. We think about games, the ones that we enjoy are the ones where we get to express like what's important to us that maybe we don't get to express in the real world. My perfect example, I love Skyrim. It's a role-playing game, and I play as a axe-wielding barbarian warrior woman, and I kick in doors, and I kick butt all day long.
That's what you do in real life, Kelly.
But I do it with my words in real life, and it's really fun to have an axe, and so this idea that the kind of psychological fulfillment I get of feeling empowered and feeling like I control the world around me, that's not something that I get necessarily from my daily life. And when people play different games, they're attracted to the things that make them feel fulfilled. And so I think the positive part of games is that as a clinician, it helps me to understand what drives you. Because if you're playing Minecraft in creative mode or you're playing Grand Theft Auto, those are two very different motivations to play that game. They're not good or they're not bad, but they're unique to you. And so as a clinician, it helps me understand you. It also helps me understand myself. Like, okay, I want to be a warrior woman wearing like animal skins and punching orcs in the face. And what does that say about me? But I think it gives you that space for reflection and to explore that kind of ego fantasy.
I would add as well, like we've been talking a lot about like psychology research and specifically around games. I actually read a lot of research around pedagogy, and which is a bit more of a holistic approach around psychology because we're looking at like macro effects, et cetera, in classroom settings. And there's a lot of research right now saying that a lot of the stuff we're doing in classrooms is crap. Like the majority of research, like if you look at like, there's some really interesting work that, you know, if you've looked at a lot of education research recently, you'll have come across this. It's all the work being done by John Hattie around, you know, what are effective teaching practices and visible learning, where, you know, it's a meta-analysis where they created a meta-analysis of, you know, I think they're at 1,200 meta-analyses now, so they've like looked at data, collectively looking at data around like 60 million kids worldwide over the last 20 years, looking at what is effective in education. And we can look at a lot of research and say like, oh, are games good? Are they effective? Are they bad? Blah, blah. The reality is that like homework, not effective. You know, doing worksheets, like math worksheets, not effective. So, you know, we're kind of like worried about games and demonizing games, but what we're proposing to keep instead has been proven over decades to be detrimental to education. And so I think that there's like there's a bit of a facetious and problematic obsession with games because they're such a new medium, when in fact all the old mediums have actually been proven to not be very effective, and we should really be embracing change as a way to move forward away from traditional education practices that have, you know, we've been using for hundreds of years and that, you know, aren't necessarily based in research.
I would agree with that, and I feel like one of the outcomes of at least the research that I've read, right, was that if you learn, like the constructivism movement, right, like if you learn by yourself, by doing projects like that seems to be a good indication of like a good way of learning, right? And I personally think that's the power of games, is that you learn by yourself. You're autonomous in your own learning. You're learning at your own pace. And it's just a great way to learn a complex subject, right? So that's my own kind of perspective. My perspective is more on the, you know, STEM games and how to use games for specific learning on a specific subject, right? And you can go, games can be used to encourage practices, right? And just motivation, and so that's more the gamification side of things, but they can also be used to explore an idea that you cannot be taught, right? Like you have to experience it yourself. A good example of that is the game on which I worked in my master's study, right, which was about intuitions on Newtonian physics. So things like why, if I have two objects of different weight, if I let them go at the same time, why do people think that the heavier object will fall to the ground faster, right? But that's not actually the case. That's a misconception. And changing that is really hard. And there's about 30 years of research in physics on that particular question and these types of questions that show that schools just fails horribly at this. Like students at the university level passed at, you know, they have 90% grades in physics, right? But when you ask these questions, they just don't know it. Like they don't intuitively understand what they said, and you know, the formula that they wrote and everything. And it turns out that there's a really good test that was used to basically assess whether you intuitively understand these concepts, right? And changing that test is really hard. So that it's the golden standard in science education, that test there. And the video game that we worked on at that point had a big impact on that test. And so that's why I got going with educational games myself, is because of science research and education showing that, well, my own experience in school showed personally that it didn't work for me, right? But then I did project-based learning at school, and it kind of converted me, and so I just want to keep adding to that if I can with games.
Are there any more questions out there? Anyone have any concerns? In the back there? 1 minute per question. 1 minute per question.
Thank you so much. This session was very useful for us who are not really, you know, very familiar about digital games and gaming. However, the main takeaway, the whole essence of this session was that digital games are not inherently bad. The way that you game or the way that you play the game makes it either bad or good. Meaning, I think if you play it excessively, then it becomes bad. But otherwise, it's okay. It's good. I mean, to be playing games. And one of the things that I'm not fully convinced, though, is that some of you made a comparison between playing digital games and football. Playing football. I don't see how they can be compared, because I would understand that playing football, physically playing football, is it provides you with physical exercise and socialization, and you interact with the real people and team spirit and all those kind of things. And gaming is, of course, perhaps if you are playing with playing online, you will have your friends interacting with you, but not physically though. The other bad thing, as I see, about digital gaming is that you can play 24 hours, by 7. And for football, you are limited by the facilities, and the timing. You can't play 24 hours, so therefore, I don't see, playing football is as addictive, if you like, as playing video games or digital games. Could you highlight on that a little bit?
Well, we don't really have any more time. Kelly, do you want to?
I can answer quick.
Answer quick.
Okay.
Lightning round.
So, the comparison to football is that they are both games. They are both systems that humans engage with that have a quantifiable outcome that we enjoy doing, typically. There are dangers in football. Like, you can get hurt. There's also, it's super competitive, and it can also get super aggressive. And I say that as someone who loves soccer. I played soccer for like 20 years. And yes, there is a physical component in soccer that you are not going to get in, say, playing Call of Duty or Overwatch. However, as someone who also played esports semi-professionally, I can tell you it is exhausting. Mentally exhausting, having that kind of mental strategy, trying to figure out the places to be, when the spawn points are, coordinating with your teammates in real time, trying to capture that flag or that outpost, and trying to defeat the other team. Like, it may not be a physical exertion, but I can guarantee you it is a mental exertion. And it's the kind of thing that if we saw somebody playing chess, we wouldn't necessarily say, oh, well, they're not playing a game. Like, we know the kind of mental strategy and practice and training and discipline it takes to play chess. And you're seeing that come across in esports, and especially games that have those kind of tactical components to it. As far as social, the majority of people who are playing games are doing it socially. And so the person may not be physically with them, but they're still real people that you're communicating with. Especially with teens and especially with adolescent boys, games are the number one way that they communicate and socialize with their friends. And that's via online. And when they go to school, they're talking with their friends about the games that they're playing. So they're inherently social in that aspect too. And then that doesn't even get into the social surrounds of the games, like the YouTube channels dedicated to them, or the Let's Plays, or the forums where people are talking, discussing, and strategizing, and really coming together as communities. So I don't juxtapose it to soccer to say that they're the same, because they're not. They are very different. But they are unto themselves a very unique, you can think of them as a sport, and they are inherently social, and it's, okay, I think I'm probably done. Am I out of time?
I was just going to add, another perspective to that is I spend all day talking to people, and I'm really glad when I can sit down with, my PlayStation and not interact with somebody for, an hour. As bad as that sounds, I think we do need alone time and downtime, and games are a great place to do that.
Okay, thank you so much for your attention and your participation. We're really happy to have had this conversation. If you want to talk to any of us, we'll be available afterwards. Thank you so much for your...
This is it. Oh. Can everybody just move to the hallway? We need to break this room for the keynote. So we just need to get out. Please vote on the VISAG declaration as well. Thanks.